bring on our next guest, Councillor Graham. Can you hear me?
Hello, Mark. I can hear you. I can see you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. I know you've been busy this evening.
A wee bit, aye. Just come out of the NEC meeting.
All right, amazing, man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, man. It's a crazy time that we're all in just now. But first of all, we've been in lockdown due to the COVID-19, and then you have the Black Lives Matter protests erupting all over the country. And just to get your thoughts on this very complex issue.
Well, I helped to organise some of the first Black Lives Matter stuff 5 years ago when Ferguson was happening, and at the time we were quite able to link the Ferguson and activists from Los Angeles and so on with people here, particularly with the Sheku Bayoh campaign, but also other campaigns and family groups in England who'd suffered death at police violence. And so I'm very encouraged that something that happened so quickly, with the murder of George Floyd, which reminded us so much of the death of Sheku, actually, because he was asphyxiated in similar circumstances. We have to say that it's good that people responded in the way they did, but you just wish they had responded like that when we had these deaths right here on our doorsteps at the hands of our own police. In fact, my friends in Australia and in Mexico who are there now during lockdown are actually commenting on, there's a big problem with Indigenous people being killed by police in Mexico, but it took the death of a guy in America, in Minneapolis, to get Mexicans on the streets protesting about police violence. Similarly, in Australia, 400 Aboriginals have died at the hands of people. So you think, well, good that people are on the streets. I appreciate that they are, and that suddenly there's been a mass upsurge because people here who live in Scotland, who've grown up here, have connected with that viscerally, emotionally, based on the experiences they have of racism right here. The racism there, they connect with the racism here. They may not be experiencing the same level of police violence. We don't have the same number of killings. We have one killing. It's a very egregious, which obviously Sheku Bayoh's case is the Black Lives Matter cause celeb for our country, which we need to sort out. But I was very encouraged by the younger generation of people coming out on the streets, and those demonstrations would have been a lot bigger, probably 2 or 3 times bigger had it not been for social distancing. I was one who was affected by that too, that I couldn't quite risk it being in the exact risk category. But also the Bayoh family themselves are nurses, so they're people who are coping with the COVID death crisis, which has affected Black people more than anybody else, as we know. So these risks and factors were being weighed up in America, as we saw. The most important thing there was that people got on the streets and protested the immediate threat of police violence going out of hand. But in 5 days, they, through their rebellion, achieved more in those 5 days, arrests, charges, sackings, than any of these other police incidents have provoked before. And it's definitely been a sea change moment for looking at race relations here in Scotland, because things can't stay as they were, and they won't.
Why do you think it is that there has been such a big change in the way that people are looking at it?
There's a number of things going on. The honest thing is that the issues around institutionalized racism are very hard to tackle. They're not easy things to look at. We've made lots of great strides. I mean, if you look at the public discussions about even the surveys that you have about people's general attitude to migration, to the presence of minority communities, the surveys that we've done show that the social attitudes in Scotland, majority of people are moving in a more anti-racist direction. But that minority that's racist, was more ethnocentric in their thinking, is a bit more viscerally and more vocally racist. And that's bearing out in the everyday experiences of particularly younger Black people, but also people of all ages. One of the calls I made last Monday night was with about 120 BME people talking to some of our politicians. I basically got them to just listen. About 40 of our politicians to listen to 60 odd people, one after the other, say their experiences. This is from Caithness to the Highlands, every city and every town in this country every ethnic background, every minority ethnic background that is, and they all said the same thing, that I've experienced racism on a casual daily basis in my life, that it's affected my job and how I do my job, the racist perceptions that people have about me makes them undervalue and not take me as seriously and exclude me from things that happen in my life. Young people see their elders and their parents and their grandparents experiencing that, and then they've grown up only with Scottish institutions. They're too young to know what it was like before Scotland had a parliament. So everything that they're experiencing is about what the Scottish state and Scottish society has done to marginalise and limit their prospects, racially discriminate against them. So the casual racism in the school, where schools don't properly deal with it. There was a sequence of parent after parent telling us what they were experiencing in terms of racism in the school, the failure of the schools to challenge racism properly, to properly punish people's children for being racist, and then the lack of black people actually teaching in the schools. This is a city which has got somewhere between 15 and 20% of the adult population, the adult working population, is from a minority background. 20% of the school children in the schools are from a minority, yet hardly any of our teachers are. So if you can't see black teachers in front of you, you as a young black person, how are you going to get any confidence in yourself that this society or system belongs to you? That's the rage that people were expressing on those demonstrations, and they're quite right to do so. And I'm with them on that.
I'd like to ask your opinion on people who, because I think that I've certainly seen people who are certainly not outwardly racist in any level, but kind of going into that all lives matter kind of wormhole. How would you explain to someone who thinks, I'm not racist and I think all lives matter? How would you best describe to someone your experiences and why that's quite offensive right now?
Okay, of course all lives matter. But the problem is that all don't matter. The problem is that black ones are clearly don't matter as much as white ones. And that we're dealing with the black ones because that's the one that has a problem right now, especially when it comes to policing. So obviously all lives should matter. And that's really what people are expressing when they say that. It means that they personally value it, but they're not taking responsibility for the fact that they are part of institutions in their everyday life which actively exclude black people and non-white people, even if sometimes that's unconscious. And this is the thing, you have to investigate yourself. If you want to be properly anti-racist, you have to accept the fact that it's quite possible that you are benefiting to some extent from what we now call white privilege. And that white privilege is the privilege, even if it's not monetary, even if it means you don't have a massive, great career that's bigger than a black person. So it means, though, that you can walk your daily lives without worrying about somebody judging you on a racialized basis. You don't have to worry about police mistaking your slight gesture as an act of aggression, which could lead to your death. You don't have to think about it. That's a privilege. The fact that you don't have to worry about that kind of harassment in your daily life, you don't have to worry about people calling you names and actively excluding you from job opportunities in the same way because you are white. So even though you're not actively racist, you are part of a structure that is, and you have to take responsibility for trying to change the structures that you're part of. If you walk into a room in your everyday life, in the city of Glasgow or any big city in Scotland which has a serious size black population, talking Edinburgh is about 10% black, put it in perspective, it's about the same as Liverpool, which has had a black community for ages. Ours is much bigger than Liverpool. So put it in perspective, it's not like the old days where there was no black people. We've got lots of black people. So if you walk into a room in any social or work or economic situation and you don't see any non-white people, then exclusion has happened. Question it, ask why there are no black people in the room, and see if you can change the structure that you're part of, whether it's your workplace, if it's your church, or whatever it is.
And as someone who's, I've just been doing my best to just listen, as I think is all I'm capable of. And obviously, just to let anyone who's maybe watching this platform is open to all walks of life. And if anyone wants to come on the show and share their experiences, then everyone is welcome to do so. Is there anything else that I can do as a white male to obviously, and this is something I would like to point out to some of other of my friends who have been saying all lives matter, is that as someone who's from a working class background, things might not have been easy for me. And then rather than use that chip on my shoulder, which I think I have used in the past, whether it's been people talking about, feminism or anything like that, and I've maybe in the past said, oh, but it wasn't easy for me, kind of thing. And that's obviously that was an immature point of view that I've maybe had in the past. So now, as someone who's looking to help and be an ally, is what can we do?
Right. What we can do best, in my view, and as a community activist first, that's where I want to do my anti-racism. And I've always done it in Springburn because that's where I needed to do it. And the way I was able to challenge racism was by dealing with people's most important practical problem, which was around their housing and around poverty. And you tackle those and you do it in conjunction with solidarity with refugees, as we've done for a long time in Springburn. That's why we've got the good situation we have in many ways, that we've got a degree of unity now going on in our working class community. But we built a working class unity from inclusion of the refugee and minority communities in that discussion about what it means to be a working class community. If your perception of working class is just white people, then you've got something wrong with your perception of that. And if it's just male, then it's not a proper representation of the working class, because the majority of the working class currently is women. So you need to have a perspective which includes those people's experiences of how we deal with capitalism, because it's slightly different, and there are some nuances about how we're oppressed under that which are a bit different. But that doesn't mean we can't be good allies and have solidarity. So when we're building local anti-racist campaigns, it's very important that it's white people who are challenging the racism of other white people, because they're going to say things to you that they won't say to me. And I always say to people, if you've got racist friends or whatever, don't unfriend them on Facebook and Twitter. Have the argument with them. Patiently draw it out why their thinking is wrong. Because if you think that might be a bit exhausting and it's just easier to press the block button, well, think how much more exhausting it is for somebody like me or other people from the minority community to make those arguments with people who have those views. You are best placed to make that discussion and make that point with people that you know who have racist ideas. That's where we need white people's, most of all, is to challenge other white people's thinking and to think about the connection to how Scotland has a history of racism, slavery, and colonialism, which the racism of yesterday is directly related to the racism we have now. Because, of course, the institutions that we are worrying about now, which is the courts, the police, the lawyering, the institutions, etc., they all date from the times of slavery. So, of course, these institutions have inherited a groupthink, a way of practicing, an institutional set of practice which is discriminatory. It can't not but be, because it's racism and capitalism. We have to make those connections politically and therefore understand how people feel in their oppression and connect how they feel oppressed with how we do. Because there is a connection. Of course there is. It's the same people doing it.
And then what about, how much responsibility does the media need to take for inflaming tensions between different groups?
Well, in one sense, there's been a deliberate strategy of the last week or so since the Black Lives Matter demo to distract us with the statue debate. Now, it happens to be that I've been involved in the statue and names debate, but the statue debate has sort of been hijacked as a trope with which to avoid discussing the deaths of black people in custody. It's funny how all these people, these racists, I would say, were more concerned with the physical well-being of a bit of stone in a park or in a square than they are with the actual lives of black people. They should be ashamed of themselves because they're missing the point. If the point of these demos was not necessarily about the statues, but they come up as a result of the connection between racism of now and the racism of yesterday. I've got some ideas and plans for that. I've been working on that subject for about 15 years myself. I've been working with activists who have been talking about the history of slavery and the legacy for a good long while before me. So at least for 3 decades in this city, people have been working, or there have been Black history tours in the so-called merchant city. We need to have a discussion about naming and statues, but we need to have that in a context where the country and the city is talking about its slavery legacy. Until it's able to acknowledge that, and we don't just acknowledge it by just simply removing the evidence without a discussion. We need to have a discussion and educate the public as to why there is a need to remove those things, because they need to get a connection with capitalism and slavery.
And I think that you've got exactly on Cllr just now.
Yeah, to plug it up. Well, much as I love to plug the BBC, but sometimes you have to work with the man to get the message across. We did a documentary 2 years ago with David Heyman, a 2-part documentary called Slavery, Scotland's Hidden Shame. And it partly was based on the book It Was the Us by Dr. Stephen Mullen, who is a legend who this book was published 10 years ago, and it was a revelation about the truth about Glasgow's slavery history. It looks at the architecture, who the owners are. So the book really influenced how this program came about. And in the program, there's 2 parts. In the part 1, David goes to Sierra Leone, which was a slave island that was owned by Scots or run by Scots, which was run for 80 years and monopolized the trade in enslaved African human beings. The Scots were right there. The first golf course in Africa was right there on that island as they showed slave masters or slave buyers around their island. Then he goes to Jamaica in the second program, which I'm more involved in that one. But there's a lot of community historians, professors, academics laying out the story of just how deeply involved Scotland was in the slave trade and in therefore the riches and wealth. Our cities grew rich of 3 basic commodities: tobacco, sugar, and cotton, all of which were almost entirely grown by enslaved Africans in plantations in the Caribbean and in the United States in the Chesapeake Bay of Virginia. So we were right there. That's why we got streets named after these places. That's why we got streets named after some of the perpetrators. It was their city. They designed it. Of course, they laid it out to lord themselves up. But the city now, Glasgow, has to have a different way of telling its story, but it can't not tell the story of slavery. So we need to have a work out how we're going to tell that story.
Looking forward to seeing that. And shouts to David Heyman as well for doing some great work. We've got some comments coming in. I'll go to the comments in a minute. Have you got enough time for me to go to... I was going to play your Leave to Remain track.
All right. Okay.
Is that okay?
On. Yeah, of course. Why not?
Yeah, I think it's a good track to play. And then we'll come back to any comments. If anyone's got any questions for Graham, leave them in the comments and we'll get back to that. But let's check this out.
The problem in the past has been the man turning us against one another. We have been unable to see the truth because we have been fighting for our little piece of church.
We have to live to remain in this Inglaterra. Me reach way back in the day. But we can't speak, we can't sleep, we can't weep, we indeed, we can't breathe. For deceit, distrust, and disdain. Know that the beast be unleashed, the beast unleashed, the beast unleashed fits cage. It's in them paper, it's in them book, hate in them faces, word and dirty look. It's in them swag, St. George's tats. Them not interested in Union Jack. Them not black on that rascal flag. It's in them school, the wisdom of food on the television, evening news. It's in them souls since days of old. When them vanquish we ancestors, slaves caught and sold, them whitewash history and plunder all we gold. England's dreams, so it seems, got lost on the high-rise, low-life schemes. This survival, this survival, make the alloy on them hubcap gleam, brighter than them halogen, the headlight beam. Me have to leave to remain. This Inglaterra, me reach way back in a day. Me have to leave to remain. But all this hate want to drive we insane. So let I breathe and give I live to remain. Screw the workers, ruled by shirkers, proud of all the brain donors them have nurtured. North and south, them shut them out. Take every single immigrant and put them out. We are English and we are proud. In it. It's in them pigment of them melanin. Sick I salute and song them sing. It's in them hedgerow and avenue. Forgotten masses, chosen few. While Mama Nature choke, on the bile them spew. Jah, hit the queen, and all that she mean. England's dream of pastures green were lost on the IUI's low-life schemes and the silence of her victim screams. We have to leave to remain. This Inglaterra will reach way back in a day. We have to leave to remain. But all this hate will see the end of days unless you let I breathe and give eyes leave to remain.
I got you. Ready?
Yeah, he's
1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Yo, this is Charlie Tuna from Jurassic 5 live and direct here in Glasgow, Scotland, and you call that radio?
Upon you, we are here to tell the people that we hear you. One God will not allow us as people of conscience to lose our morale. We see the crimes of this government, how they support every dictator and criminal on this earth. Sometimes you can feel down. Sometimes
you're tuned in to You Call That Radio. We have Councillor Graham Campbell in the studio. Thanks for joining us, Graham. I've just got to go through some of the comments. I went in the Sheku March 5 years ago. The flyer is still on my pinboard. Has there been any change in the development of that? For anyone who doesn't know, this is someone who's a friend of a friend as well. By all accounts, did absolutely nothing wrong, and it seems safe to say it murdered by many police.
It is not safe to say that. No.
It's alleged.
Allegedly, you have to say he was killed, but you cannot say he's murdered because that's subject to a public inquiry, which was called after the failures of the Lord Advocate, the main chief prosecutor in this country, to take the case to court. The family tried a private prosecution, that didn't work. But in the first place, the problem we had was that when Sheku was killed, there were no procedures in place for the Commissioner of Police to suspend or fire them. The Police Independent Review Commission, the PIRC, which is supposed to investigate police misconduct, they had no powers to compel the police to give evidence, and everything about it. If you don't know the case, look at the Disclosure Scotland documentary about the Sheku case. It goes into some of the circumstances surrounding Sheku's death, but suffice to say that 9 police officers were involved in an incident which had him dead within a few minutes of encountering them in Kirkcaldy on May the 3rd, 2015. And what's particularly upsetting is that he was asphyxiated, mainly because 2 very large police officers sat on him after he'd been maced, cuffed, leg cuffed, and prostrate on the ground. And the procedures that police have are very clear that you're not supposed to put pressure on somebody's chest cavity because then they can't exhale and breathe in and out. But they sat on him, 2 large guys, one 18 stone, one 20 stone. They sat on him and asphyxiated him. Now, the argument would obviously go, which the inquiry ought to get to, is why did they treat him with such a degree of violence? And the reports were that there was a man who had a knife and there was a large black man running amok. Well, the guy is 5'9", he's an inch shorter than I am, and he had no knife on him. He had taken ecstasy, and it looks like that the MDMA had a terrible effect on him. He was a bit wobbly on his feet, but should he be dead? No, he should not be dead. He didn't attack anybody. And then the police made up a story that he was attacked. He was attacking the police officers. And they made up a story which the Police Federation then put out there. By the way, I'm sure if the Police Federation is listening, I'm still being very careful with my words. If you want to sue me, try me. by the way, they did write to me when I spoke at the Sheku Bayoh rally on the day of the demonstration. They actually sent me a lawyer's letter about 3 days later, threatening me with what I had said in my speech. But I was very careful. I didn't say they were murderers. I said that they were responsible for his death, and they were. The question is, what happened? Was racism a factor in that? And that's why we need that family to get justice. They've now waited 5 years to get the inquiry, and that's good that that public inquiry is coming in the autumn, and there will need daily large demonstrations out there in the way that they had in London when the Stephen Lawrence inquiry was on. This is our Stephen Lawrence moment. This is our Black Lives Matter moment, and it's really important that their campaign is supported because it's expensive. You know, they haven't had legal aid in the time that they've been trying to fight the police, yet the police who took their son's life, their boy's life away, they have the backing of free legal advice. You know, so it's such an unfair fight in many ways, and this family, unfortunately, has been not as been able to be as high profile as they could have been in terms of getting support and solidarity. That Black Lives Matter, I hope, will be a moment where that campaign becomes the #1 campaign in this country to fight institutionalized racism, and it needs to be.
Which certainly on everything. So hopefully they can get justice. We've got comments coming in from Alex Doherty's listening in from Springburn.
Hey, Alex, how you doing, mate?
Lovely guy, Alex. Hope you're well. Angela says the statue's not the issue. We actually spoke about this last night about how just exactly what you mentioned about why are we arguing over statues when that wasn't the whole point, and it feels like that is one good thing that has came out of it though is the amount of people that had no idea. I thought we all knew that about the history of slavery and the statues and the names of the streets. I thought that was common knowledge, but it seems like it wasn't that well known, and there's lots of people that are absolutely disgusted by it all.
It's pretty clear it wasn't that well known.
Yeah.
Despite our efforts to make documentaries, programs, newspaper articles, public meetings, and the response I generally had to the documentary when we put it out 2 years ago, and then again a year ago when it was repeated, was very positive. People definitely wanted to know more about the legacy. They wanted to know why they didn't learn it in school, and there's lots of issues around why they didn't learn it. It's not true that we don't actually learn it, the slave trade in our curriculum. We do. It's just that the history sources that we're using are generally only talking about the English ports, Liverpool, Bristol, and London. They don't really talk about too much about the Glasgow involvement in it. But Glasgow is equal to Liverpool, London, and Bristol. But also Scots were massively involved in Liverpool, London, and Bristol, particularly in Liverpool. The 5 biggest slave journeys companies were Scots. William Gladstone's was one of them. So that's one of the statues in George Square. You know, his dad paid for his education through being a slave trader. So Scots were deeply involved in it. And we've had a sort of, you know, my friends call this a sort of organized forgetting about the slavery bit of the legacy of the so-called merchants. So of course people have come to this, walking the streets of places like Buchanan Street, Cochrane Street, Miller Street, not knowing who these people are, because they're just seen as merchants. They sold stuff and they got rich. And they were great commercial people, but they were trading in human blood. They were slave traders. They were vampires of the first order, and people should understand that that was part of their history. Their institutions have been created from that. Now, you might say, well, that's deeds of the past. What does it matter now? Well, you know that we had a compensation package paid to slave owners, not to slaves, paid to slave owners after the abolition of slavery in 1838. We only just finished paying the debt bill from that. You know, we had to go for a long-term government bailout, and it was worth the kind of size of a bailout we had in 2008. We only stopped paying that back in 2015. So all of your lives, if you worked before 2015, you've been paying the taxes to pay back historically these slave owners from 1838. You've been paying it back. So it's a live issue. This money is still here now. The families who inherited that wealth still have those fancy houses in the country that they got from that, the Edinburgh townhouses or the Glasgow office blocks. They still own these resources. So it's not a past issue. This wealth is with us now. It's there in our institutions like the city council or the university. And reparative justice means that we have to make amends to the people who we robbed and enslaved. That means
what do you think about a fair way of not to get into the statue and the street names debate too much more, but just the final word on it? What do you think is the way forward to deal with it?
the way forward is to have a proper discussion, and I've been part of efforts in the council to get us to have a sort of report into our own legacy in the council, in the city. Look at all our law provosts and so on. Look at where the money for city chambers came from, and when we look into that report comes back, we'll report it back to the findings to the council, hopefully in the new year. And if it wasn't for COVID, it would have been reported in October. Once this report comes, we'll have to take some reparative justice steps, and obviously we've been talking about having a museum of slavery, colonialism and empire. I've been on a committee on it for 2 years. We've been working with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights so people can support their efforts to get a museum up and running. Just this weekend, Alexander Thompson Society, the architecture group, have been they had a poll of their supporters, and they decided that the best use for the Egyptian halls on Union Street, the one with the great big hoardings next to the station here, they want to make that the Museum of Slavery and Colonialism, and maybe have that as a way of saving that building. So there's a discussion to be had about how we mark this heritage, right? Eventually, these street signs may be changed at some point, but I think we have to make a discussion about what we want the street signs to say. I think in the first place, the slave owners' names need to be noted, and it needs to say where they got their money from, where they own their plantations, how many people they exploited and allowed the deaths of. It should say that on these placards so that we know full well what that heritage is. So before we even talk about removing stuff, let's have a discussion about that legacy. If the legacy is to mean anything, we have to change how we deal with racism now. If it doesn't have a context now where we remove institutionalized barriers in work, making sure our workforces are actually representative. I'm doing work on that now in the council to try and get more BME people into the council. So we've doubled the numbers in the last 3 years. We're trying to go and double that again by the next 2 years to make it more representative. So all institutions have to do that across the public sector especially. But any social setting you're in, think about how you can reach out to the BME different communities. There's at least, probably at least 100 different nationalities of groups of people with organized groups representing them, living in this city. Reach out to them, include them in your thoughts and plans in the political actions you have, whether it's in the community, whether it's food banks, or doing stuff in the park and stuff. Try to reach out with them. We've done that in Springburn quite well, I think. And by including people, you get more of a perspective, you get more unity, and you start to tackle racism from the bottom up.
Thanks, Graham. Just going back to the music video, David said we filmed this in Governor Jail, now Orkney Street Enterprise Centre. Could you just tell us a little bit about that song, that video, and also that was obviously released around about the time of coincided with Brexit. What difference did Brexit make in the landscape of day-to-day racism?
Well, there's no doubt that. That was made by my bandmates Old School. The writer is, as you saw, playing the guitar in the video. That's Martin Chomsky, and he's a really brilliant poet and the writer.
I know Martin is absolutely brilliant.
So I wouldn't claim those my words. I'm just the actor reciting them. So I played the role. But yeah, we wanted to say something about Brexit because Brexit has been, often it's talked about not as being racist. Well, it is, and it is racist because the three main ingredients for the Brexit referendum were: we want to exclude foreigners from having competitions with jobs with us, being the British, and then we want to have rules which have a second-class citizenship for those who choose to stay, and that's what we've got. 3.5 million people who live here who are from the EU countries now have the second-class citizenship that anybody who's from another country other than that has been experiencing. That's why we're in these lower grades in the labour market. That's why we're doing security guarding, cleaning, social care, all the low-paid jobs. That's why we're doing those. It's in the past, in the 50s and 60s, it would have been those sorts of jobs that white people didn't want to do anymore. Now it's jobs which have a certain low status within society, and it's the same system that we're trying to fight. Brexit was a misunderstanding in one sense that somehow England or Britain is a country that's oppressed by Europe, when in fact it's one of the main perpetrators in Europe. In fact, Europe follows many of the rules of Britain itself, from Thatcher's time. They're carrying out continental-wide Thatcherism. I would have thought they would have loved that, but the racism and the anti-foreigner xenophobic sentiment that was very strong down in the south of England was what determined us having that referendum at all in the division of the Tory party. And I'm glad to say that there was less of that xenophobia here in Scotland. There was still a little bit of it. And we can't kid ourselves that as a North European country with a colonial and imperialist history, that we're immune from these nationalistic responses. And in a way, it's akin with what's happening in the rest of Europe. All countries like us, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they've all had racist far-right backlashes against globalization or the appearance of liberal integrationism, the so-called watering down of their national culture. There's been a sort of resistance to that because there's a fear of global multinationals controlling things when ordinary citizens don't really control stuff. And that's partly because we've got governments elected who don't challenge capitalism and what it does. Until we start electing governments that do start to challenge those rules, we will still feel that sense of disempowerment in the global structure. And I think that's where the essential and hostility to Brexit come from. But it went down an avenue which was possible in England of right-wing nationalist, imperialist xenophobia, kind of Empire 2.0 thinking, which, we should be great, we Britain should be great, we don't like it, the idea that these Europeans should be getting on better than us. It's that mentality. And I don't say that that's missing from Scotland, but it's certainly not as prevalent. And that's partly because lots of Scots have had to be migrant workers, both in England and in Europe and America. So I think more of us get why travelling and being internationalist, having freedom of movement, these are all really important things. Having global influences on your own culture enriches your culture. Imagine what we'd be eating if we didn't have all those cultures from the world. We'd be eating really bad food still. These are things which enrich our lives, which we appreciate and often take for granted. I suppose Scotland is a big country, and I do take hope that because we see ourselves that way and we don't see ourselves as so hostile to Europe, we're not in the same category.
Absolutely. I get that. But when I released a song, I released it years ago, Triangular Trades, which was about, it talks about slave trade, it talks about the street names. It was 2014, I think it came out. But I copy and pasted the lyrics recently, and I was actually shouted down for posting pro-unionist Tory propaganda, and it's also coming from. I didn't even believe that this was a thought, but there seems to be a lot of people who say that Scotland doesn't have any racists. I don't know if you've come across that yet.
Well, it's something I've come across all the time. We're all Jock Tamson's bands nonsense, right? I've always countered that whenever I've come across it, because it is nonsense, and it could only be nonsense because Scotland's been part of an empire. It benefited from this empire, which was premised on white supremacy, and dominated an empire, created slavery, practiced slavery for 250 years before abolishing it, yet has an ideology about itself that, we're great because we abolished slavery. What about the 250 years when you were profiting and perpetrating from it? We have a wrong historical memory of our role in this, and we haven't really deconstructed our British imperialist traditions. Now, in a way, because we have an independence movement, we have an in with a possibility of escaping from that. But if we're going to escape from that, we have to do it with a proper assessment of the country's actual history, its role as a perpetrator. As my friends in the Caribbean will say, there's a Caribbean reparations movement, and there's about 12 governments in the Caribbean islands which have taken 8 European countries to court in the International Court for reparations from slavery. Britain is one of them. And if Scotland becomes independent, it will be the next one added to that list.
I think that would be a good way to sort of end things on, Graham, would be how badly do we need independence, and what positive differences would that make?
Well, for a start, we'd end the empire once and for all. I often say this, but Babylon must fall because we still have a state that's structured like an empire. It doesn't have an empire except a few islands, and basically Scotland governed as an external province. You know, we have a chance to finally once and all destroy the British imperial state, which is a relic of the 19th century, never mind the 20th century. So if we get rid of that, become a proper republic, and hopefully a republic without monarchy, but that's for later to decide. But if we become the progressive society we could be a very great inspiration to the people in England to create something different too. But we can only do that by leaving them, unfortunately.
Brilliant stuff, Graham. Just a few comments coming in. Fantastically articulated, Graham. It was one of the only countries with a veto across the board, referring back to the EU stuff. Poet and legend in that video. Glasgow has many ships and rooftops, says Tam. David Blair says, great hearing you speak about Black Lives Matter and everything else, Graham. Keep on fighting the good fight and inspiring myself and many others. And thank you for sharing your knowledge. Education is so important. And I think it is. I think that's where the root of many of the problems we're facing right now is education. Do you have any final words on how people can help out and support whatever it is you're doing just now, man?
Right now, the Black Lives Matter movement is really forming itself, and particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, it's really quite growing and organising itself into subgroups around education, economy, art, and so on. So there's lots of stuff going to be put out, which you will see across social media. Support their efforts to make that count. Let's attempt to organise something material from this. We need an anti-racism movement that finally will be led by Black people, not led by well-meaning or less well-meaning white people. It's going to be led by Black people because they're the ones most affected by it. So be a good ally, show your support for them, follow their lead, take advice from them, invite them to speak wherever you have a platform to do that, and challenge racism where you see it, in your community. But I always get frustrated that a lot of anti-racism, so-called anti-racism work is done with people who are already anti-racist. We need to challenge it with people who are racist. If we don't challenge it there, we're not going to be successful in our long-term goal.
Right, stuff. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Really appreciate you coming on the show, and feel free to come back on any time. And if anyone else wants to spread the word on this movement, then this is a platform that is always available. Thank you very much, Graham. Also on that note, there's a No Justice, No Peace, which is a new project that Steg G, local legend, has put together, and it actually features the track that I was discussing earlier on, Triangular Trades. All money goes to the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, which works to eliminate racial discrimination and harassment to promote racial justice across Scotland. It's a compilation album of 21 of some of the best rappers in the hip-hop community in Scotland. I'm just going to bring the banner up, so if you want to support, I believe it's £10 for a download. The link is here. And all the proceeds go to No Justice, No Peace. In the name of the charities, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. So if you like a bit of hip hop, or even if you just want to support the movement, then go to, I'll put a link in the comments as well just now, so you'll see it here. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or Twitch, you'll see it in the comments just now. It's this one here. It's so please do support it. Thank you very much to Graham for his time this evening. We still have another local legend waiting in the wings. We have Amelia Baylor, who is launching her brand new EP, and it's also time for a raffle. We're going to have a raffle. We do a raffle. This week we're doing a raffle every day for everyone who's supporting us on Patreon. So someone's about to win a case of beer, and then we're going to have Amelia Baylor doing some songs from her new EP that came out yesterday. You're tuned into Local Legends on You Call That.
Brothers and sisters.
Is that you, Daniel? Are you before me?
You call that radio?
Hello, yes, this is Dog.
Call that radio?